Hi, everyone, and welcome to the MOG Effect, Inside the Chaos and How to Gain Clarity When Managing Government Digital Transformation, the podcast where we unpack how government restructures impact digital teams, platforms, and the public. Hi, I'm Akhil Bhandari. I've been working with Salsa Digital for the last 6 years and worked in public service in the Department of Communication and the Arts for 8 years before that in publishing, looking after websites.
And I'm Julia Topliss, Digital Practice Lead at Salsa Digital. We are your friendly co hosts, and this is our second episode. And we're setting the stage by asking the big question: who owns this page? Governance nightmares and approvals in flux. So let's start with the basics. Akhil, when departments are merged or split, how do you even begin to manage content ownerships and approvals?
So as we touched on last week, the level of complexity depends on the size of the MOG, and then therefore potentially also how much structure changes and how much content is associated to those structures. So when you have corporate services move around, it's not so bad, but when you have public information around programs, specifically high profile programs, like the NBN and other things like that, and if that moves with the department, then that makes it trickier. So it'd be good to kind of have an audit of the content and the site that you have, work out what is owned by whom, and if that's actually being impacted by the structure at all, and does that get moved away? If an MOG is having an incoming departmental area to come in with new content, then you'd have to also do a bit of a check on duplication, potential duplication, which is quite rare, and also kind of age of how old things are. So it's good to have a quick audit, figure out who owns that content internally and also from the incoming or outgoing agency in areas and business areas. And figuring out who owns it can be tricky, but generally it's all a lot of the content on websites for government is kind of reflective of the structure of the department itself. So it's kind of much easier to segment content based on those functions within the department itself. So it's a bit easier to find. And if there are orphan pages, then it's really picked up by the publishing team. If no one actually owns it, there might be a question about why it actually exists on the site. Otherwise, try and find maybe if there's a duplicate or similar content, because it's probably the case that if it's orphan, it's either out of date or was replaced by something else. You can then track the owners. So, in the past, when I was working at comms, we often had fairly in the initial early years, we had a setup where we had a lot of all the business areas had to basically report monthly on a check and a review of the content and make sure that it was up to date and actually sign that off. So that was signed off by at AS level to make sure that everyone's reviewed the content and made sure it's up to date. So that way it's all accurate. This does come in effect, especially useful for when there's Senate estimates, which I have actually there's a good story there, which I've heard of where websites and departments have been pulled up at Senate estimates to say that content was out of date or incorrect or inaccurate, and that can be both embarrassing and also very bad for the department and the AS and the people at the Senate estimates hearing. So making sure content is up to date and accurate is pretty important. So having either an ownership or structure for who owns content, or even just a spreadsheet that basically has the structure in there and who owns what by the areas could be quite useful. So the other thing to do is maybe have internal publishing guidelines so that people know what to do. And then as they're putting in new content, you can actually track and who's putting that in and who the owners are. So if you can capture that up front, that makes it much easier than trying to chase everyone down afterwards. So having more formal framework or structures in terms of publishing internally, so whether that's a RASI model or just internal publishing guidelines would be quite useful, depending on the size of the organization and the amount of content you have. It's much more useful when you have thousands of pages and lots of content and areas of content versus 100 or 200 pages. So some of the campaign sites maybe not so much, but maybe when you have a corporate website, larger websites may need something like that. Then if there's a change, then you want to triage potentially the high priority stuff first, often things that are related to the MOG itself, the new ministers' announcements and other changes, or even the incoming change of programs and election promises if it's a MOG from an election. They'll be the high profile ones. They're the ones you probably want to put focus on and put up quickly and make sure that it's quite accurate as well. So and then if all else fails, make sure that you're communicating to the stakeholders as much as you can. So, and then get that work done once you can after the mock settles a little bit and there's a bit more free time.
That sounds like pretty intense, right? What happens when
Yeah.
there's like multiple stakeholders that might lay claim to the same content? Does that ever happen?
Yeah, that's it's pretty funny because quite often having multiple people trying to claim content's quite rare, only because no one wants to own any content. You know, most most departments are within the agency itself. The areas within the department do not want to own content. It's another thing that they have to manage. So most people don't want to claim content. When there is duplication or there's potential aim, it's really around understanding the function of the page and the function of that SME or that's subject matter expert area or business area, and then where does it work? So it also kind of goes back to the internal publishing guidelines where you might actually suggest have in there guidance on the content type and the functionality that owns it, whether it's based on functional or whether it's based on who publishes it. So, web admin teams can own a lot of content on websites because they just publish things, or it's owned by the functional area of the agency who are the subject matter experts on it. So things around legal content is often left to the actual business org unit who know the subject matter, or if it's just structural things, then that's normally left to web teams. So it really depends on what type of content it is. You can also just really just get the two conflicting owners to have a chat about what it is. Often you'll find they're happy to give up content if they can. So that's normally a case. And then you can also then just nominate and document that new owner. And then that basically gets tracked in that document if you have a publishing guideline or if you have a spreadsheet that tracks all the owners of the content.
So what I'm hearing is that there's a lot of structure and frameworks that feed into this sort of governance structure, but human beings don't work that way, right? Um, so like, I guess you're kind of thinking, I know what the question Julia's going to ask, but it's like, how do you actually prevent approval bottlenecks, right, in the early weeks of transition?
Yeah, I mean it can get tricky, but in terms of the structure, it's yes, humans don't do that, but this is where the corporate services, the publishing team, the web publishing team, whether that's in your communications area or branch, or if it's in the IT branch, there's often a web area, and they'll be responsible for that. So they'll be managing the publishing in general. The websites are really their domain, and they'll have the ability to manage who owns the content, who can get access to the content. They'll also determine the publishing model, so whether that's distributed publishing or centralized publishing. So some agencies will have centralized publishing. That means all the content gets written up in Word doc probably, or anything else, and then gets sent as a request generally with an internal the publishing guidelines and get sent to the internal team, and they will then publish that content. So they often do a review and they'll do an accessibility check to make sure the content's accessible and also do an alignment with the brand guideline and other guidelines for the department itself. So that kind of takes away a lot of that issue about who owns it, and they'll also be able to track if they have questions around who sent that request, they can then just ask those as the owner of that, basically the content. When you have a distributed authoring, that means that the authoring is done across the agency or department. That's where it gets a bit trickier, and that's where and this would work and is quite common in very large departments and organizations where they've got 1,000, 2,000 people, or even, business areas of 20, 30, 40 business areas. The central publishing just wouldn't work. The web team would not be able to keep up with the amount of publishing that gets done. So that in that case, that's where the guidelines and those processes are super important, knowing who the owners are, if there's an issue, tracking that down. Now, in terms of bottlenecks, again, that's why the distributed publishing is quite useful because then it's not up to a central team to try and do everything. And it really just does to come down to those approvers. There are a lot of approvers who like to make their mark on the changes they go through. So things do get slowed down sometimes. But it's up to them to have that efficiency. As I mentioned before, the content has to be kind of accurate and up to date. And if it isn't, then it comes back around during the Senate estimates. So the idea to kind of minimize bottlenecks is generally there's an approver. It may not have to be a senior person. That can be, it's up to the business area to kind of assign someone else. So it could be someone further down, or there could be a small group that has a kind of a secondary role to approve when that approver is not able to. So that kind of helps with, taking a bit of pressure off those approvers, and then also just prioritizing publishing. So depending on what type of content it is, if that approver is busy, is away or unavailable, then potentially just kind of making sure that if it's not priority or not urgent, then maybe you can wait a day or half a day. If it's going to be weeks, then yeah, that's a different question and situation altogether. So prioritizing publishing things generally around the ministers or the minister's office is always a higher priority versus more kind of utility work or pages. So it just depends on the content, understanding that urgency. And as I've found, if you're trying to get content published, approvers are generally the more senior people. If they're busy, take a bit of the burden off. So kind of minimize that decision fatigue instead of making them read the entire piece of publishing, or the content could be like pages, could just be hopefully just a page. Just give them a summary, potentially just give them a quick summary of what it is, and what needs to go up, so that helps them, and then they can make that decision quicker to amend or approve. Sometimes it's more factual information, so they may need to review it themselves, but sometimes they don't. And then if there's any issues, escalate early so you can get that information up there as quickly as possible, but also identify issues as quickly as possible so they can be amended. And that's super important when you have things like embargoed content or press releases, which are very time critical. So you want to get that kind of done as early as possible, have everything finalized, ready to go, instead of kind of leaving it to the last minute and impacting the time criticality. And if you have a log of the information on a spreadsheet, again, you can potentially use that type of thing. So I think the final thing on kind of helping with that is just having, as I mentioned, the last series is also having a content lifecycle where once the content does go up, it has a regular review stage. So whether that's a quarterly review or 6 month or 1 year, but having that kind of making a cycle there and a process to review content is very good hygiene for the content, and then also just stops a bloat of content being built up on the site. So if you don't need it to be up there, if it's only timely, then you can remove it or update it.
Wowzers. It sounds like such a juggling act, right? And, when we designed these vodcasts, we said we're going to try and keep them to, around the 12 to 15-minute marks. We're at 13 minutes a kill. So let's
Yep.
split this one in two,
Yeah.
and let's make this part one of episode two, and let's call it quits here, and then we'll go into the next set of questions on this topic. Thanks, Akhil.
Excellent. Thank you, Julia.